All right. Last time we were talking about the purpose of the 70th week. So we looked at Daniel 9 especially, but also some other passages. And before we go on to the next question that I want to consider, I want to look at a couple passages that relate somewhat to the last question we considered, and also the one that I'll be mentioning in a moment. So let's begin in Joel chapter 2. Joel chapter 2, and Jean Gross, would you read verse 32?
Joel 2:32. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call.
So as we saw last time, after God has accomplished his purposes for the 70th week, then all Israel shall be saved, as Paul says in Romans 11. And so here we see that there will be deliverance in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. And then it says, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. Okay, then turn to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. And Dennis, would you read verses 29 to 31 in Matthew 24?
29 and 31?
Through 31.
All right. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
All right, so this passage tells us what will take place immediately after the tribulation of those days. And so we're told that at that time, immediately after, shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And later we'll talk more about this, but my point, or one of my points at this time, is none of that happened in 70 AD. So as we've talked about, there are some who say that these things, some of these passages were fulfilled in 70 AD. But again, clearly none of that happened at that time. And so commentators, because of that, they have to come up with all kinds of fanciful interpretations, usually relating to the fact that oftentimes that they deny a literal return of Christ. And then they say that these things that Dennis just read about the sun and the moon and the stars, that's all figurative, that it's not to be taken literally. And that's, again, because clearly it did not literally happen in 70 AD. But in fact, these events are spoken of many times in Scripture, and they're to be taken for what they say. They're not meant figuratively, or it's not an allegory or something, but it's meant to be taken just for what it says. Look in Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13, and Dick, would you read verses 24 to 26 in Mark 13?
Okie dokie. Mark 13, you said 24?
24 through 26.
Yeah, 24 through 26. Okay. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory.
So here again, this setting is after that tribulation. And again, it speaks about the stars, the sun, the moon, and what will take place at that time. Then a couple more, turn back to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 32. And as I said, these signs in the heavens are spoken of a number of times. Another one is Ezekiel chapter 32. And would Dan or Laura read verse 7, Ezekiel 32, verse 7?
And when I shall put thee out, I will cover the heaven and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give her light.
All right, so the sun, the moon, the stars are all darkened by a cloud we see in this passage. And then go to the book of Revelation, chapter 6. And this is also spoken of here, Revelation chapter 6. And I will begin in verse 12, Revelation chapter 6, verse 12. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? So here's a more detailed passage about what's going to take place. Again, this is the sixth seal. And so we know that this is immediately after the tribulation of those days. And then one more in chapter 8 in Revelation. And Paul, would you read verse 12, Revelation chapter 8 and verse 12?
Verse 12. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened. And the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise.
And so here you see this is the fourth angel speaking about this same time. Okay, so we have again talked at some length and clearly seen God's purposes for the 70th week. And in doing so, we've largely answered the next question I want to raise. But I want to consider this anyway, separate by itself, because it's very important to understand this. And so the next question I want to consider is, whom does the 70th week concern? Okay, and so let's again go back to Daniel chapter 9 as we begin to consider this question. So as I said, we've mostly answered this question already in studying God's purpose for the 70th week. But there are some things here that need to be clearly understood and emphasized. So Daniel chapter 9, and would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 24?
For 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy.
Okay, we've studied the 6 purposes in this verse that God has for the 70 weeks, but I want to again note that the 70 weeks, it states here, are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. So clearly this refers to the Israelites and in particular to the city of Jerusalem. And then go to Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah chapter 30, and would Dan or Lisa read verse 7?
Alas, for the day is great, so none is like it. It is even so. Oops, I'm sorry. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it.
All right, so this speaks of the time of Jacob's trouble. So it's not the time of worldwide trouble or any such thing in this verse, but it's the time of Jacob's trouble. And then go back to the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 4. And in Deuteronomy chapter 4, Meg, would you read verse 30?
Chapter 4, verse 30. When thou art in tribulation, and all these things are come upon thee, even in the latter days, if thou turn to the Lord thy God, and shall be obedient unto his voice.
All right, so it says in verse 30, when thou art in tribulation, and all these things are come upon thee, even in the latter days. And so who is thou? And if you look back at the first verse in chapter 4, it says, now therefore hearken, O Israel. And so again, clearly, when it says when thou art in tribulation, it's talking about when Israel is in tribulation. And then we read a few minutes ago as we began today, Joel chapter 2 and verse 32, where it says that there will be deliverance in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem and in the remnant. And so, again, that's another place that's very clear to whom this pertains. And then actually go back to Joel again, and this time chapter 3 in Joel. So we read earlier chapter 2 and verse 32, the end of chapter 2. So now Joel chapter 3, and would Tim or Jean read verse 1?
Okay, Joel 3, verse 1. For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem.
So notice that at that time God shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. And then again in Joel chapter 3, Gabrielle, would you read verse 2?
Joel 3, 2. I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land.
Okay, so at that time God will gather the nations, and it says, and will plead with them for my people and for my heritage Israel. And then go to Matthew chapter 24 once again. Matthew chapter 24. And Akun, would you read verse 16?
Matthew 24:16, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains.
Okay, so you notice in verse 15, it speaks about the abomination of desolation, which we've spoken about. And then after that, when they see that, the instruction in verse 16 is, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. So Jesus doesn't tell everyone in the world to flee, or even everyone in Israel to flee, but specifically them which are in Judea. And then look at, again, at Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13, and Pakinatan, would you read verse 14? Mark 13, verse 14.
When ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not. Let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains.
So again, Mark says, then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. And so all of these passages, and we could look at many more, clearly are focused on Israel and especially on the city of Jerusalem. So there's a sense in which I think it's helpful to divide the world at that time into three groups of people. So the first one I'll mention is the nation of Israel. And so clearly, as we've seen, God's chastening at that time is going to be aimed at Israel. So there will be a time of chastening where God will purify the nation of Israel to prepare them for their salvation at his second coming and then entrance into the kingdom. And that's what Paul's talking about in Romans 11, where he says, all Israel shall be saved. That takes place after God has purified the nation of Israel by chastening them in the 70th week. And that chastening upon Israel, as we've read a number of passages, will be much more severe than any previous time in Israel's history. They've had trials and chastening in the past, of course, but this future time will be more severe than any of those times. Turn back to Psalm 69. Psalm 69, and Hanhui, would you read verse 24?
(69:24). Pour out thine indignation upon them, and let thy wrathful anger take hold of them.
Okay, this says, pour out thine indignation upon them. And again, the word them, pour out thine indignation upon them. Them is, again, clearly Israel. So, if there's any question about that, if you look at Psalm 69 and verse 6, it says, let not them that wait on thee, O Lord God of hosts, be ashamed for my sake. Let not those that seek thee be confounded for my sake, O God of Israel. And then also again in Psalm 69, verse 35, for God will save Zion and will build the cities of Judah, that they may dwell there and have it in possession. So this is a time when God is going to pour out his indignation upon Israel. By the way, Paul quoted here in Psalm 69. Dominic, would you read Psalm 69, verses 22 and 23?
Sorry, 69, 22, and 23, Dan?
Yes.
Okay, 69, 22, and 23. Let their table become a snare before them, and that which should have been for their welfare, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened, that they see not, and make their loins continually to shake.
Okay, and Paul quotes these verses that Dominic just read. Turn to, and we've looked at these previously, but turn to Romans chapter 11, and you will see that Paul quotes these verses, and he clearly quotes them again as having to do with Israel. So Romans chapter 11, and beginning in verse 7. What then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. According as it is written, God hath given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear unto this day. And David said, and so now he's going to quote the verses that Dominic just read. So again in verse 9, and David said, let their table be made a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a recompense unto them. Let their eyes be darkened that they may not see, and bow down their back alway. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. But rather through their fall, salvation has come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? So again, Paul quotes these verses again clearly as pertaining to Israel. Then turn to Isaiah chapter 65. Isaiah chapter 65, and Jean Gross, would you read verse 12?
Isaiah 65:12. Therefore will I number you to the sword, and ye shall all bow down to the slaughter, because when I called ye did not answer, when I spake ye did not hear, but did evil before mine eyes, and did choose that wherein I delighted not.
And so notice he says, therefore will I number you to the sword. And again, clearly the you here is referring to Israel. Jean read verse 12. If you look at the verse right before that, verse 11, it says, but ye are they that forsake the Lord, that forget my holy mountain, that prepare a table for that troop, and that furnish the drink offering unto that number. So this, again, clearly is speaking of God's judgment upon Israel. They are the ones that forget my holy mountain. So I mentioned I think it's helpful to think of three groups of people on earth at that time. And so the first one, again, is the nation of Israel. And as we've just talked about and looked at some verses, God will chasten them at that time. Then a second group of people would be the Gentile nations. Turn to Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21, and Dennis, would you read verse 24?
And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled.
Okay, the 70th week for the Gentile nations, this will be the height of the times of the Gentiles. This will be their high point for the times of the Gentiles. So the Gentiles will be ruling over Jerusalem at that time. And so that's a second group that we need to have in mind when we think of the 70th week. And God will deal with the Gentile nations later at the second coming. And he'll pour out his indignation against the Gentile nations at that time. So as we've seen, his purpose for the 70th week is focused on Israel. But then at his second coming, that's when he will take care of the Gentile nations. And then a third group who will be on earth at that time will be the saints. And so you have Israel as a nation, and then second you have the Gentile nations, and then third you have the saints. And so the saints are given instruction about how to be safe at that time. We read earlier where he said them in Judea should flee into the mountains. And they're given promises that God will protect them and provide for them at that time. So God is going to pour out his indignation upon Israel, but not upon the saints. He's going to protect and provide for the saints. And now we know, of course, that there will be many saints who are martyred also during that time, but that's not God's wrath against them. That's the wrath of the devil and the Antichrist and his followers. And so again, you have those three different groups of people that we should keep in mind when we're thinking of that time. So I've heard many speak of the 70th week, or again, many call it the tribulation, as though God's wrath will be against the Gentile nations at that time. In fact, I've even heard some suggest that it will come against the saints, but that's clearly not true. And so it's important to keep that in mind as we further consider these things. That so the answer to the question, to whom does the 70th week pertain? Again, it's God is specifically pouring out his wrath or chastening the nation of Israel and purifying them. All right, then the next question that I want to consider is specifically how will God accomplish these purposes? So we've seen what his purposes are, especially in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 24. And we've again emphasized clearly that his purposes concern Israel and Jerusalem, but how will he accomplish those purposes? Turn to the book of Isaiah, chapter 10. Isaiah chapter 10, and Dick, would you read verse 5?
Okay. Isaiah 10:5. O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation.
Okay, so when we ask the question specifically, how will God accomplish his purposes during the 70th week? God is going to use the Antichrist to chastise the nation of Israel. So as Dick just read in verse 5, it says, O Assyrian, and that's the Antichrist, O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger. So God will use the Antichrist to display or to pour out his anger toward Israel. Chapter 10 begins, chapter 10 and verse 1. He says, Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed. So the chapter begins by referring to the religious and political leaders in Israel, them that decree unrighteous decrees. And there are many passages in Scripture regarding the needy and the poor and the widows and the fatherless. Look at verse 2 in chapter 10. And again, remember, he's talking about the religious and political leaders in Israel. Verse 2, to turn aside the needy from judgment and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey and that they may rob the fatherless. And so again, you remember there are a number of passages in Scripture where he talks about the importance of caring for these peoples. And we see here in verse 2 that the religious and political leaders in Israel are persecuting them, and they're neglecting them and not taking care of them. They're taking away their rights. And then again in Isaiah chapter 10, would Dan or Laura read verses 3 and 4?
Ten, 3 and 4. And what will you do in the day of visitation, in the desolation which shall come from far? To whom will ye flee for help? And where will ye leave your glory? Without me they shall bow down under the prisoners, and they shall fall under the slain. For all his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still.
Okay, so God is warning here the religious and political leaders in Israel about the day of visitation. And then we come to verse 5. O Assyrian, again, that's the Antichrist, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. And then again in Isaiah chapter 10, would Paul, would you read verse 6, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 6?
I will send him against an hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge, to take the spoil, and to take the prey, and to tread them down like the marrow of the streets.
So the Antichrist will be sent against an hypocritical nation. And of course, that's the nation of Israel. And then, and of course, we studied some about the Antichrist in the past. It's not the desire of the Antichrist to be used for God's purposes. He's not trying to do the will of God. He's not trying to be used by God, but in fact, he will be. Isaiah chapter 10, and would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 7?
7. Howbeit he meant not so. He meaneth not so. Neither doth his heart think so, but it is in his heart to destroy and cut off nations, not a few.
So he meaneth not so means the Antichrist, again, doesn't mean to do God's will. He's not trying to do God's will. Instead, as it says in verse 7, it's in his heart to destroy and cut off nations, not a few. And then once again in Isaiah chapter 10, would Dan or Lisa read verses 10 and 11? Isaiah chapter 10, verses 10 and 11.
As my hand found the kingdoms of the idols, its graven images did excel them of Jerusalem and of Samaria. Shall I not, as I have done unto Samaria and her idols, do to Jerusalem and her idols?
So he says in verse 10, as my hand hath found the kingdoms of the idols. And you can see as you look at verses 10 and 11 that the Antichrist is not favorable toward all of the idols in the nations. In fact, he wants to destroy the idols. Now, why would that be? Turn to Daniel chapter 11. And so you see, this is one way that clearly, although he's not meaning to do God's will, he in fact will, because he wants to destroy idols, and God wants to destroy the idols in Israel. And so why would the Antichrist want to destroy idols? Daniel chapter 11, and Meg, would you read verses 36 and 37?
And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all.
Okay, so the Antichrist will magnify himself above every god. And so he will insist that he alone should be worshiped. And so he wants to destroy all of the idols, all of the gods in the nations that he seeks to conquer. And so that's one way in which God will use him, is to destroy idols. Then turn to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 25. Jeremiah chapter 25, and beginning in verse 8. Therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, because ye have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north. So notice here it's the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, my servant, and notice the king of Babylon here, God refers to him as my servant. And then continue in verse 9, and will bring them against this land and against the inhabitants thereof and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them and make them an astonishment and an hissing and perpetual desolations. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the candle. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment. And these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And of course, notice the number there, 70 years. So the king of Babylon and the Babylonian captivity that took place back during Old Testament history is a picture and is prophetic of the 70th week. So as we read here, as God used the king of Babylon in the past, he will also use the Antichrist during the 70th week. And as the king of Babylon did in the past, the Antichrist will make the land a desolation and an astonishment, again in the 70th week. And then look in Jeremiah chapter 27. Jeremiah chapter 27 and beginning in verse 4. And command them to say unto their masters, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, thus shall ye say unto your masters, I have made the earth, the man and the beast that are upon the ground, by my great power and by my outstretched arm, and have given it unto whom it seemed meet unto me. And now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And then again, it refers to him as my servant. And the beasts of the field have I given him also to serve him. And all nations shall serve him, and his son, and his son's son, until the very time of his land come. And then many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of him. And it shall come to pass that the nation and kingdom which will not serve the same Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and that will not put their neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation will I punish, saith the Lord, with a sword and with a famine and with a pestilence, until I have consumed them by his hand. And so again, the king of Babylon here is prophetically speaking about the Antichrist, who also will be, in a sense, God's servant, a rod in God's hand, a rod of anger in God's hand. And then go back to Isaiah chapter 10 once again. Isaiah chapter 10, and would Tim or Jean read verse 15 in Isaiah 10?
Okay, Isaiah 10:15. 15. Shall the axe boast itself against him that heweth therewith, or shall the saw magnify itself against him that shaketh it? As if the rod should shake itself against them that lift it up, or as if the staff should lift up itself, as if it were no wood.
Okay, so again, the Antichrist does not intend to do God's will, but in fact, he will unwittingly be used by God or sent by God, as Isaiah uses the phrase, the wine cup of this fury. There are many mentions of this in Scripture. We've seen some already, but turn back to chapter 8 in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 8, and Gabrielle, would you read verse 4?
Isaiah 8:4. For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria.
So notice a mention here of the king of Assyria. And again, that's the Antichrist. So he is going to take away the riches and the spoil. Then turn back to Psalm 17, 1:7, Psalm 17. And in Psalm 17, Akun, would you read verse 14?
Men which are thy hand, O Lord, from men of the world, which have their portions in this life, and whose belly thou fillest with thy hid treasure, they are full of children, and leave the rest of their substance to their babes.
So notice verse 14 begins, from men which are thy hand, O Lord. So God uses unbelieving men to do his will, including the Antichrist in the future. In Psalm 17, again, if you notice in verse 9, it mentions the wicked. And again, if you go down to verse 13, you'll see again it mentions the wicked. And so that the wicked here is the Antichrist. So verse 9 says, from the wicked that oppress me. It's the Antichrist and also his followers. Okay, verse 9 again, from the wicked that oppress me, from my deadly enemies who compass me about. And then verse 13, arise, O Lord, disappoint him, cast him down, deliver my soul from the wicked, which is thy sword. So we saw in Isaiah 10, the Antichrist is the rod of God's anger. Here in verse 13, the Antichrist is thy sword. Then go to Psalm 140. Psalm 140. And so what we see with the Antichrist again is he's an evil, wicked man, no question about that whatsoever. And he has no intention whatsoever to do anything that pleases God, quite the contrary. But God in his wisdom will use the Antichrist as a rod of anger in his hand to chasten the nation of Israel. And that's all fine and good, but then the problem is, as Babylon did in the past, the Antichrist is going to exceed the boundaries which God set for him. That's where Babylon got into trouble in the past. If you remember the passages we just read, the king of Babylon, God refers to him as my servant, but and so God intended him to chasten the nation of Israel. But he went beyond what God intended him to do, and the Antichrist will do the same. So in Psalm 140, and beginning in verse 1, deliver me, O Lord, from the evil man, and the evil man there is the Antichrist. Preserve me from the violent man. which imagine mischiefs in their heart. Continually are they gathered together for war. They have sharpened their tongues like a serpent. Adder's poison is under their lips, Selah. Keep me, O Lord, from the hands of the wicked. Preserve me from the violent man, who have purposed to overthrow my goings. The proud have hid a snare for me, and cords. They have spread a net by the wayside. They have set gins for me, Selah. And so, again, the Antichrist is going to go beyond what God intended for him to do. And he's going to specifically begin to target the saints in Israel. And so that's what these verses I just read in Psalm 140, deliver me, O Lord, from the evil man, from the violent man. That's the cry of the saints at that time as the Antichrist begins to target them. And that's why Christ is going to destroy him at his second coming. Turn then to the Gospel of John, chapter 13. John chapter 13, and Pakinatan, would you read verse 27?
Answered, he it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon.
And then also the next verse, verse 27.
And after the sop, Satan entered into him. Then said Jesus unto him, that thou dost do quickly.
Okay, so a clear example and a major example of God using evil men to carry out his purposes would, of course, and a clear example of that would be Judas Iscariot. So that's why here in John chapter 13 and verse 27, Jesus said unto him, that thou doest do quickly. So Jesus didn't try to stop him from doing this or try to dissuade him at this point. Quite the contrary, he says, do it quickly. And then turn to the book of Acts chapter 2. And again, Judas Iscariot, in no way was he trying to do God's will. Again, quite the contrary. But God used him to ultimately bring Christ to the cross, which of course is our salvation. Acts chapter 2 and verse 23. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. So it was wicked hands that crucified the Lord. Yet, as you look at verse 23, those wicked hands unknowingly carried out or fulfilled the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. So Peter says, ye have taken. So clearly they had a choice. They had free will to take him or to not take him. And they freely chose to take him. And so only in the mind of Calvinists is this confusing or contradictory. But in fact, both things are true. And I don't even think it's really that difficult to understand or comprehend. That Christ was delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, and yet that was fulfilled by wicked hands. And the men who did that have full responsibility and the guilt for having done so. So God in his wisdom can use even evil men, even the wicked, to carry out his will. Then, turn to Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24 and verse 44. And he said unto them, These are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms concerning me. So it's absolutely the case that all things must be fulfilled and will be fulfilled, but God at times will even use wicked men to fulfill some of these things. And yet, again, these wicked men are fully responsible, fully guilty for the decisions that they make. We'll just look at a couple more before we conclude. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 20 says, Who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. So Christ was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but he was manifest in these last times for you. And then Isaiah chapter 53. And this is possibly the most well-known Old Testament passage that's prophetic about the cross. And notice Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 10. It says, Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. So it pleased the Lord, God the Father, to bruise him. It was the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God that Jesus Christ should die for sin. And then let's conclude today with John chapter 10. And so there's a sense, well, not a sense, it's very much the case that the Father willingly delivered his Son over to death. In fact, as we just read in Isaiah, it pleased him to do so. And it's also true that his death was carried out by wicked men who had no intention whatsoever to do the will of God. But it's also true in John chapter 10 and verse 18. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This commandment have I received of my Father. So Jesus Christ had to willingly allow them to put him to death. They had no power to take his life. He easily could have destroyed them, but he came to die. And so all of these things are true. And again, unless you get confused with Calvinism, I don't really think it's that complicated or difficult to understand how all of these things could be true. And so again, God will use the Antichrist as a rod in his hand to chastise the nation of Israel. So that is specifically how he will carry out his purposes at that time. All right, thank you all.
And excuse me, what was that verse in 1 Peter 1 again, please?
That was chapter 1 and verse 20.
20. Okay. Thank you.